Hello and welcome to the Print Soft Cover, our program where we unveil new books and speak to the authors. I'm Anusha Ravisood, and this is my pleasure. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Anjana Menon. And here we unveil at the Print Soft Cover her new book. A really exciting read. I have gone through the pages of this book and have thoroughly enjoyed it. Onam in a Nightie, and this is a Harper Collins a publication. And what a fun book, I must say. And Anjana is with me to discuss, to answer my questions about her book. And I have a lot of questions. Anjana is a former journalist, an entrepreneur, an author, and this is her first nonfiction book. And it is so fun to read. Anjana, thank you so much for joining us here at The Print, and welcome to The Print Softcover.
Thank you so much for having me.
I must ask you, one, anyone who looks at this book at any bookstore, I must tell you, the first thing that will make their eyes pop is definitely the title. Please do tell me the tale behind the title of your book.
So, to be honest, this wasn't the original title when I started, writing the book, when I submitted the manuscript. My working title was a little different. Because the book is set in Kerala, it was Beyond the Backwaters. And as we got into rounds and rounds of editing with the book, as an author, then you start sort of thinking, okay, does the title convey everything that you wanted to convey? And I thought one of the things about the book, like you pointed out, most readers have come back and said, it was such a fun read. It brought a smile to our face because it's like full of humor, and some of it is also self-deprecating humor. And I thought, well, Beyond the Backwaters is nice, but in some ways it's a tame title. It doesn't capture the fact that the book is funny. And so, I went through the process where I was talking to, friends and former journalists, and, how do I arrive at a better title? And, one of them was asking me about the chapters in my book, and one of the chapters, which I think, which in some ways, holds the book together. It's kind of in the middle of the book. And I said, oh, well, this chapter is about Onam and the Nightie. And he said, but why isn't that your title? And I was like, well, yeah, absolutely. That should be the title. And that's how I arrived at the title. And it does capture the fact that there is some humor in the book, and it is, there is a lightness to the book, which was very important for me to communicate.
Well, this book is all about your life in Kerala during the quarantine. You did not expect, as you say in the book, you did not expect to spend so much time in Kerala. You shuttle between such metropolitan cities and this quaint town, a sleepy town, like you say. You draw a comparison between the town in your book, which I will not reveal, that's left to you, and Malgudi days. And you speak about how small little things kind of gave you hope. I had a lot of fun going through the pages. Like you mentioned, it's a very fun book. But when you started noting it down, as you mentioned, that this was supposed to be a journal of your quarantine, so did you expect that it would turn into a book?
No, absolutely not. Because I think what had happened was that I was, visiting my parents who live in this small town, and I'll give the name away. It is Thrissur in Kerala. And, because they retired here, and I think during the pandemic, they felt really isolated. So they asked me to come down, and I did. But at the time, the quarantine rules were really strict in Kerala. So the government required you to do a room quarantine for 14 days, which means that you can't interact with anyone else at home. You're stuck in your room. I was on a completely different floor. I couldn't, meet my parents. They were on the ground floor, but the most I did was just wave out to them from the first floor. And that was the level of interaction. So I think when you're cooped up in a room and you have nothing to do, you can't even, really go to a different floor. You're just confined to that space. Things slow down quite a bit. And also, everything overall, I think, had slowed down for people. Everyone was, working from home, trying to figure things out. And so there wasn't really much to do. And so when things slow down, everything hits you with a greater velocity. It's almost like a level of mindfulness sets in. And also because, and I've captured this in the book, my experience of the quarantine monitoring by the Kerala government was beyond all my expectations. I almost felt like I was getting mollycoddled. I was getting 4 or 5 calls a day from various departments asking me everything from how are you feeling today? Do you have a cough? To, how's your mental health? Are you depressed because you're cooped up? And, like you mentioned, this doesn't happen in Delhi. It doesn't happen in London. It doesn't happen in the other cities that I've lived in. And so I was just amused, overwhelmed, grateful for the attention, all of that. And I started keeping a journal, which, some of it I would post on Facebook. And, I always say that my posts, they get buried and I get FOMO because not enough people are saying, clicking the like button. But I started getting calls from friends saying, why haven't you posted today? What happened today? Who called? What did the government do? Who called? How did you spend your day today? And then some of them said, this is like a book. We can't wait. And that's when I thought, okay, maybe there is a little bit of potential to this. I should take the journaling, a little more seriously, make it a little more detailed, and stop thinking of it as a Facebook post. So after a few posts, I stopped and I started keeping it as a more intimate journal.
You speak about the various calls you got through the day. And for me, while reading the book, the first turn or a twist in the tale came when you finally revealed who your friendly was. And so I need to know, there are so many characters, whether it is Shivan Kuti or you speak about meeting four-legged friends also in various setups. So
Yeah.
there are faceless people who you mentioned, who you probably struck a very personal relationship with during the quarantine. So
Yeah.
do they know they are in the book, that they are characters in your book?
No, I don't think so. Not yet.
So, would you like to surprise them, let them know that their tales made up a big chunk of your book? What would it be like if you were to tell them that you've written about them in your book?
I'm hoping that because I've captured them with as much honesty as possible, and you know, I'm hoping that my voice for them is one of empathy and camaraderie, and that they'll be delighted.
While reading the book, I remember sometimes, so a lot of the reading I did was at the end of the day after a really crazy newsy, busy day of
That's
work. And I would suddenly burst into these chuckles, or, I would just laugh out loud at some instance. I really want to know, did you also do that when you were writing it? Do you recall, just smiling to yourself or laughing to yourself when you were writing about these hilarious instances in the book?
Uh, so I think that I wouldn't say I was laughing out loud, but sometimes when I would write it, I would smile a bit. I would read back and I would think, okay, yeah, that, there is a little bit of irony and humor in this. And as a writer, you have to keep some distance from your work. You can't fall so much in love with it that you think, oh, this is absolutely the best. I mean, of course, you'd like to write it to the best of your ability, but I think a little bit of that distance is necessary. And so I would smile and leave it at that, really.
Like I said, this was you were in quarantine when you started journaling this, and there is also components of when finally the lockdown was eased and you could go to the places that you probably remember from a pre-pandemic era years before that you came back to Kerala. But I must ask, this was also a very challenging time for humanity as a whole, more so for us in India, given our resource crunch, etc. And for us in the newsroom, I'm sure even those who read the newspaper, watch it, knew what a harrowing time it was. It continues to be, but thankfully, I think it's much better. We've learned to cope with it much better. So, was this book also an attempt to try to look at the more positive aspects that came out of your quarantine? Was it? I wouldn't call it an escape, from the harsh realities of the pandemic, but was this a very deliberate attempt to at least highlight the bright sides that came with your quarantine in Kerala?
So, I wrote the book in 2020, and the pandemic in 2020, I think when we look back, we'll all agree was a little slightly kinder than, what we as a country faced in 2021, where it was really, like you rightly point out, it was harrowing and it was ghastly and it was really difficult because, that was the most virulent and um, unmanageable variant of the virus, so to speak. So at the time that I wrote it, I think the world over, we were still trying to come to terms with the fact that there is this virus, there is a race against the virus because we're trying to come out with vaccines. And we were still at the stage where everybody, in fact, was really careful. People were trying very hard to make sure that they wouldn't get the bug. People were sanitizing, wearing masks. Things hadn't taken the kind of turn that they did in 2021. So, for me personally, I think I wrote it because I was stuck in a place and I was new to the place, and it was, almost being confined to a 10-12 kilometer radius, because you also don't stray very far in a pandemic, right? Most things are closed. So I think it was a book that came from having to be in some kind of a cave or a tunnel and only having the experience of things around to kind of, satiate your senses or talk about or discover. And so the storytelling is also confined to, the radius of the town, but within that, I've tried to capture the bigger things. So I would say personally, it was uplifting, and as a writer, it forced me to observe more closely.
You speak about how there was this struggle either to be an insider or an outsider, because like you said, I think you were a child when you went to Trishur last. You speak about how so many years have passed by and you've traveled the world, you've stayed in so many cities, you worked in so many cities. So could you, but by the time you finished the book, could you decide if you were a Madrasi or a Hindi Karan, as you mention in the book?
No, I think I've still got an identity crisis, but yeah, I mean, I would say my fondest memories, or also the most vivid memories, are from my childhood, where I would come here to spend my summer holidays with my grandparents, because my grandparents lived here, and we would just be, tucked away into this part of the world. And so me and my brother would end up spending a month or two here. So I have visited Kerala frequently after that, but they've really just been for like a day, 2 days, a week, 10 days. They haven't really been very long trips. And, when you're trying to snatch a little bit of time with your family, in my case, my parents, then your priorities are really inwards. It's within the house, it's within the family, and you don't really look out and observe. So I think this was the first time that I was here for several months, and so I could actually devote my time to something else.
In the book also, you detail how the pandemic perhaps have changed a lot of things, and some things it hasn't changed. For example, you speak so elaborately about the warmth and the camaraderie that you saw around, youngsters volunteering to help seniors, or for a public service that needed to be done during
Yeah.
on the day of Diwali in Kerala, as you recall. And you also speak about the changes that the pandemic brought in, whether it was something as simple as a supermarket run, or whether it was this decades old restaurant finally deciding to make door deliveries. So,
Yeah.
did What were these your biggest takeaways in the sense, has the pandemic affected, or did the pandemic affect uh, your the establishment or people's identities as they are? What stayed the same? What changed?
I do think that the pandemic has altered everybody's psyche, because I think it's shown that there is a different way to do things, and that in order to survive, you have to be flexible, and partly that resilience, that we talk about, the human resilience, which is also somewhat a theme that is captured in the book, comes from being able to adapt to situations, and try and manage the situation and actually get ahead of it. So I think a lot of things have changed. People have also realized that, unfortunately, tomorrow is promised to no one. And so I think uh, that's probably the sad part, because many people have lost their loved ones, and it's been sudden. They haven't had time to grieve, they haven't had time to cope. um, I think that's been the ugly side of the pandemic. And the not so ugly side, I think, is you know it's brought people together, because they've learned that it's important to support each other, and that the only way to get through this is to really work or be a community, and to help each other out. During the really tough phase in 2021, there were so many stories um, about how people were trying to collaborate on social media and help others, whether it was for medicines, whether it was for an ambulance, whatever it was. Friends were helping friends, family, neighbors were helping each other. So I think, to an extent, it's taken this huge tragedy for a lot of people to realize that community spirit is important, and it can, and it is key to sort of survival and resilience.
It's not just the Kerala government's efforts that you've spoken about at length in the book. You just spoke about coming together as a community, and I think towards the end of the book, you mentioned this feature that I thought perhaps is unique to Kerala. You speak about commonality being put before everything else in the state. As someone who's interacted with so many kinds of people from so many backgrounds, is this a Kerala only phenomenon, as you understand?
Well, I think it's very stark in Kerala, and it sort of hit me when it hit me when I started observing, because and I think one of the examples that I've given in the book is about there is a commonality which overtakes even religious ceremonies, right? And it's with the reference to using the elephant in the ceremonial parades. So you have the churches that use it, the mosques that use it, and the temples that use it. And some things are common throughout. For example, the brass lamps that are lit. Even in some places, the architecture is similar for different, you know, places of worship for different religions. And so also, there are some festivals which are celebrated by all communities. Onam, for example, is celebrated by all communities in Kerala. And I do think, when I look at the places that I've lived in, um, this is something that is very uniquely Kerala.
I remember one during a visit to Kerala. I remember right outside a church there was the chende playing, and I was actually taken aback. I couldn't put that ever. Had I not seen it, maybe
Yeah.
I would have never imagined something like that. An instrument or a band that is so closely associated with Hindu festivals being played at a Christian fair in Kerala as well. You like you mentioned, you also speak about this undying human spirit. In fact, you put it in as many words. What was your biggest takeaway from Kerala after the pandemic? at the end of this book?
I think that there is there's a very strong spirit of community, and that is what you know, keeps the state going in a way. They've grappled with their fair share of problems in the last couple of years. They've had the devastating floods. They've had, the early ones on the COVID bandwagon where they had early cases. They've had the Nipah virus to deal with. Every year now the monsoons kind of straddle a space between being welcoming and something that can terrorize people. We've had floods again in Kerala, last year towards the end. There's been flooding in many places. So I think, but what keeps the state going and what makes the state a little different is the spirit of community, where people get together and you bounce back. So while the state administration does deliver, the people deliver for themselves. And that is what keeps it rolling in many ways.
There's something that that struck me once I finished the book. I started wondering. We've heard so much about how Keralites or citizens of Kerala are so politically active. In politics is part of their day-to-day life. Was it very deliberate to keep references to political discussions in Kerala away from the book? Because you do speak about the elections in the US, and you've written at length about what the wait was like for you, but there was no mention about politics being discussed in Kerala, although you do mention about these community setups under trees where people do come sit and lounge, etc. So was it deliberate, or did it just not occur?
So actually the book follows a certain chronology, which is really from when I got here to, when I think I had cobbled together 40 chapters. And in that phase that I was writing the book, there was no election or electioneering going on. And hence I didn't mention it. The Trump presidency was, it's a chapter, it's actually a letter to Trump, mocking his presidency, so to speak. That happened bang in the middle of, my writing. And in some ways, it was an event that the whole world was watching. And I wrote it because it was true to the chronology that I was following.
The book is filled with wonderful illustrations. Can you please tell us about the artist behind these illustrations and how it came to be?
Yes, absolutely. So, when I was actually quarantining over here, I'd seen this newspaper article which mentioned that the Kerala government has chosen for its gender budget a painting by a 9-year-old boy, as in, the painting was done when he was 9. And it was basically a collage of mothers in nighties, mind you, right? Running around doing multiple things, through the day, like all mothers and all women do, right? You take care of the kids, you do work in the house, you go outside and work. It was kind of like a bird's eye view into 1 million things that all mothers do. And what struck me was that it was done by a boy who had recognized and through his painting brought value to this work, which, over generations and centuries, we almost negate that women bring so much to the table. It goes unacknowledged, right? Because it's just seen as what they should be doing. But the fact that he had captured that in a painting, that struck me, that, here was a kid who was 9 years old, and look at his sensibility that he's captured all of this. It was kind of acknowledging the enormous contribution that women have in society and in their homes and, in raising children and, the so-called thankless job that women mostly talk about. And so that kind of stayed with me when the publisher Harper gave me a couple of designs. I mean, the only discussion I'd had at that stage, when the manuscript went in, was that I'd love for the book to be illustrated, because the book is like a quirky, funny read, and it lends itself to illustrations. And so they gave me an option of 2 or 3 covers, which were nice, but it didn't kind of, tug at my heartstrings. I just felt, no, there is another cover that I want. And I kept thinking about this kid. And then I, discussed this with Harper, saying, here is this kid who's also from Thrissur, incidentally. He lives in Thrissur. And of course, now he's a teen. He's around 16. And I managed to contact him and ask him if he would be willing to do the cover. And of course, he's a student, but he said, I'll give it a shot. And you have this fabulous cover and the fabulous illustrations he's done inside the book. And I think in a way, it was probably easier for him than someone else, because everything is in and around, the periphery that he lives in. For example, there's a chapter on this tiny little railway station. So he actually went to the railway station and he drew it, but, he's familiar with it. So I think that kind of familiarity brought a certain layer to his drawings.
So I do wish that I get to go to that tiny railway station and sit on that one bench that says SIR. And so it is such a pleasure speaking with you. In fact, I had a lot of fun reading the book, and we, The Print, wish you the very best. Wish you and your book a lot of success. Thank you so much for joining us on The Print Soft Cover.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.